August 1871, Lockville, Western Australia. The small crowd gathered at the private jetty fell silent as the wooden crate was pried open, revealing something the remote timber colony had never seen before: iron wheels, brass fittings, and the promise of progress cast in metal. The engine gleamed in the harsh Australian sun, impossibly intricate for a place where timber and sweat still move the world. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story, if you're enjoying this journey through Australia's industrial past, hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected with more untold histories. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? Now, back to Lockville, 1871. The locomotive was named Ballaarat after the Victorian town where it had been forged. It arrived months late, delayed by storms that had battered the Western Australian coast. For weeks, the timber company had run their new tramway with horses, the same way they'd moved logs for years. But as the first connecting rod was bolted into place and the boiler was filled with water, something shifted in the air. This wasn't just a machine. This was the future arriving on their doorstep. And then the engine turned over. Steam hissed. Wheels gripped iron-topped rails. Ballaarat lurched forward with a mechanical heartbeat that echoed across the bush. In that moment, Western Australia entered the age of steam. But what no one standing there could have imagined was this: within 30 years, the same machine that had been celebrated with speeches and ceremony would be left abandoned in a field, rusting into the earth. And for the next century, almost no one would care enough to save it. To understand why Ballaarat mattered, and why it was nearly lost, you have to understand the world it was born into. The 1870s were a time of industrial hunger. Britain's empire was expanding across Africa, and with it came railways, thousands of miles of track, cutting through desert, jungle, and savanna. But there was a problem. Local timber, plentiful as it was, couldn't survive the termites. Railway sleepers rotted within months, rendering entire lines unusable. The solution was hardwood, Australian hardwood. Jarrah and karri trees from the forests of Western Australia were dense, durable, and termite-resistant. A single Jarrah sleeper could outlast a dozen made of local African timber. Demand exploded almost overnight. The Western Australian Timber Company saw opportunity. They established mills in Yoganup and built a 12-mile tramway connecting their operation to a private jetty at Lockville, near present-day Busselton. The line was built to a gauge of 3 feet 6 inches, narrow, but efficient for the terrain and cost-effective for a private operation. The rails themselves were an improvisation, wooden beams topped with thin strips of iron to reduce wear. It was a rough system, built on a budget, but it worked. What they needed now was something to haul the timber faster than horses ever could. Rather than import a locomotive from Britain, the standard practice for colonial railways, the company placed an order with the Phoenix foundry in Ballaarat, Victoria. It was a bold choice. Australian foundries were still in their infancy, and most lacked the resources or expertise to build anything complex. Colonial engineers typically relied on proven British designs from manufacturers like Fletcher Jennings or Hudswell Clark, but the Phoenix foundry delivered. The engine was an 040 well-tacked design, compact and utilitarian. It had 3-foot driving wheels, a pair of 7 by 14-inch cylinders, and Gooch valve gear, a reliable but old-fashioned system even by 1870s standards. It measured 16 feet 9 inches in length and weighed just over 10 tons. Small, yes, almost toy-like compared to the mainline locomotives being built in Britain, but sturdy enough for the task at hand. And crucially, it was built to a 3 foot 6 inch gauge, making it the first narrow-gauge locomotive ever constructed in Australia. It was also the first locomotive built in Ballarat for domestic use, and soon it would be the first steam engine to operate in Western Australia. The mayor of Melbourne christened it Ballaarat in honor of its birthplace. Then it was disassembled, crated, and shipped west across the Great Australian Bight. It was supposed to arrive in July, but the Southern Ocean had other plans. Weeks passed. The tramway sat idle. Horses pulled the timber loads while the company waited, hemorrhaging money with each delay. Workers scanned the horizon each morning, hoping to see the supply ship round the coast. Finally, in August, it arrived. The ceremony was small but significant. Local dignitaries gathered at the jetty. A few photographs were taken, grainy, faded images that survive to this day in state archives. And then, with a hiss of steam and the clatter of iron on wood-topped rails, Ballaarat rolled forward under its own power for the first time on Western Australian soil. It was the first locomotive the state had ever seen. The engine quickly became a local fixture. Residents began referring to the Yoganup Tramway as the Ballaarat line, even though the engine was just one part of the operation. Children would gather to watch it pass, marveling at the smoke and steam. It hauled loads of jarrah and carry from the mills to the jetty, where timber was loaded onto ships bound for Africa, India, and beyond. But the engine wasn't perfect. Modifications were needed almost immediately. The well-tanked design, efficient as it was for short runs, didn't provide enough fuel and water capacity for the 12-mile haul. A tender was hastily built to increase storage, and the footplate was shortened by 12 inches to accommodate it. A makeshift cab was cobbled together from timber and sheet metal to protect the crew from the scorching Australian sun and sudden winter squalls. A spark arrestor was fitted to the chimney after concerns about bushfires, a constant threat in the dry eucalyptus forests. It worked. For 6 years, Ballaarat ran the line without major incident. It was small, slow, and underpowered compared to the locomotives being imported from Britain for the government railways, but it was reliable. And it was theirs. Then the world changed. By 1877, both Ballaarat and the Lockville jetty were showing their age. The timber tramway's wooden rails, even with their iron capping, had worn thin. The locomotive needed constant maintenance. And more troubling, the demand for Australian hardwood had begun to decline. African railways were finding local alternatives. Markets shifted. Competition increased. The Western Australian Timber Company's profits thinned month by month. At the same time, gold was discovered in the eastern colonies. Workers left the mills in droves, chasing fortune in Victoria and New South Wales. The company struggled to keep operations running with a skeleton crew. Production slowed. Shipments became irregular. By 1887, the mills at Yoganup had closed. The tramway fell silent, and Ballaarat, the engine that had once symbolized progress and possibility, sat unused in a shed at Lockville. In 1888, the company's assets were auctioned off. Sawmill equipment, rolling stock, timber stockpiles, and one small, aging locomotive. There was some interest. A few bidders examined the engine, walking around its rusting frame, peering into the firebox. But no one made an offer. It wasn't hard to see why. Ballaarat was underpowered, technologically outdated, and in deteriorating condition. By the late 1880s, Australian foundries were producing far more capable machines. Imported locomotives from Britain and the United States, powerful, efficient, modern, were flooding the colonial market. Engines like Ballaarat, built out of necessity in the early experimental days, were relics of a different era. Even with its historical significance as the first locomotive to work in Western Australia, it had no practical use. so it stayed in the shed. Ownership passed through several hands, but no one moved it. No one repaired it. No one seemed to want it. And then, in 1900, the shed caught fire. The blaze consumed the wooden structure quickly. Dried timber and old paint went up like tinder. By the time anyone arrived, the cab was gone. The wooden boiler lagging had burned away completely. The buffer beams were charred and crumbling. The tender's wooden frames were twisted and scorched beyond recovery. Ballaarat was dragged from the ruins and left in the open, exposed to rain, wind, salt air, and relentless rust. For years it sat there in the middle of a field, slowly disintegrating. Paint peeled away in sheets. Iron corroded from red oxide to flaking brown. Grass grew up around the wheels, eventually reaching the axles. Cattle grazed nearby, indifferent, and still no one moved it. But its legacy hadn't been entirely forgotten. In 1901, a letter was sent to the director of the Western Australian Museum and Art Gallery, a man named Woodward. The letter, from a concerned citizen, suggested that Ballaarat, as the first locomotive to operate in Western Australia, should be preserved for posterity. Woodward's response was lukewarm at best. He said he'd be willing to take the engine, but only if the Western Australian Government Railways was willing to transport it to Perth at their own expense. The WAGR sent a locomotive foreman to inspect it in 1905. His report was damning. The builder's plates were missing, likely stolen by souvenir hunters. All the woodwork was gone. The boiler mountings were stripped or damaged beyond recognition. The tender was essentially scrap metal. The metal frame and motion were technically intact, but corroded and neglected. He concluded his assessment with a line that would haunt the engine's legacy for decades. A very poor specimen of locomotive construction of its period, Woodward declined to preserve it. He suggested focusing efforts on government railways locomotives number 1 or 3 instead. They were newer, better built, more complete, and more representative of the state's modern railway history. Ballaarat was left where it was. The years passed. Rust deepened. The last remnants of paint faded to nothing. The engine became a curiosity, something locals would point out to visitors with a shrug, but nothing more. A relic. A ruin. In 1919, the Sunday Times published an article criticizing the museum's inaction. The headline was blunt: "Historic engine left to rot." The piece argued that Western Australia was allowing its industrial heritage to decay through bureaucratic indifference. It called for immediate preservation. Still, nothing happened. It wasn't until 1925 that momentum finally began to build. The mayor of Busselton, frustrated by decades of delay, contacted government authorities and managed to secure a place for the engine at the Midland Junction Railway workshops in Perth. The landowner was more than happy to give it away for free. The only cost would be transportation. A locomotive superintendent was sent to inspect it once again. He found that the tender was missing entirely. It had been salvaged years earlier, its metal frames repurposed for a new tender used by the Adelaide Timber Company. That tender, too, was eventually scrapped in the 1980s, erasing the last physical trace of Ballaarat's original rolling stock. Moving what remained of the locomotive would be expensive, more expensive than anyone had anticipated. But they moved it anyway, at Midland Junction. Railway engineers assessed the engine for potential restoration. The verdict: too expensive even for a basic cosmetic rebuild. The boiler was beyond salvage. The motion needed complete overhaul. The cost would be prohibitive. So it was placed in storage, shunted into a dark corner of the workshop's in 1929. It was briefly brought out for the state centenary celebrations. Crowds saw it on display, a curiosity from the pioneering days. Newspapers ran stories. Photographs were taken. Then it was returned to storage, covered with a tarp and forgotten again. Plans to display it permanently at the Western Australian Museum fell through due to space constraints. Plans to place it at Perth Railway Station fell through due to lack of funding. In 1937, frustrated and out of options, railway authorities sent Ballaarat back to where it had worked, Busselton. It was placed on display in Victoria Square, repainted a rather garish green, and its funnel was shortened to fit under a small corrugated iron shelter. It would remain there, outdoors and exposed to the elements, for the next 75 years. Rain and rust continued their slow, patient work. The shelter offered minimal protection, enough to keep direct sun off the boiler, but not enough to stop moisture, salt air, or decay. By the early 2000s, Ballaarat was little more than a corroded shell, its historical significance obscured by layers of rust and peeling paint. Then in 2012 something extraordinary happened. A group of local volunteers, backed by a machining company and a lottery grant, decided to try one more time. They formed a restoration team, secured funding, and began the painstaking work of bringing Ballaarat back from the brink. The engine was carefully dismantled, piece by piece. Each component was documented, photographed, catalogued. Metal parts were treated for rust using modern conservation techniques. Corrosion was removed where possible. Damaged sections were carefully repaired rather than replaced. The goal was to preserve as much of the original 1871 engine as humanly possible. New wooden boiler cladding was crafted by hand using traditional joinery methods. Missing fittings were recreated based on photographs and technical drawings from the era. The paintwork was restored to its original Victorian-era color scheme. Slowly, over months of dedicated labor, Ballaarat came back together. In the end, it was moved to the old Busselton railway station, which had been converted into a heritage visitors center. There, surrounded by interpretive displays documenting the region's timber industry and railway history, the engine was placed on permanent display under proper shelter. Today, Ballaarat stands as the oldest surviving locomotive built in Australia. Not the oldest to operate on Australian soil. That distinction belongs to imported engines. But the oldest locomotive constructed by Australian hands that still exists. It's a remarkable survival story. But it's also a cautionary tale. Here's the question that lingers. Why didn't anyone want to save it? Part of the answer is practical. Ballaarat was small, underpowered, and technologically outdated almost from the moment it rolled off the foundry floor. It represented an era of improvisation and limitation, a time when Australian industry was learning through trial and error, often producing machines that were barely adequate for their tasks. It wasn't a symbol of triumph. It was a symbol of humble beginnings. But there's another reason, one that's more difficult to quantify. At the time, no one thought history would care. In the early 1900s, steam locomotives were everywhere. They were modern, utilitarian, disposable tools. Preserving one seemed as unnecessary as saving a horse-drawn cart in the age of automobiles. Why hold on to something that had been surpassed, rendered obsolete by progress? It's easy to judge that mindset now from our vantage point in the 21st century. But in 1905, when Woodward declined to preserve Ballaarat, steam was still the cutting edge of technology. The idea that these machines would one day vanish, that they'd become museum pieces, representing a lost industrial age, hadn't occurred to most people. By the time it did, Ballaarat had spent decades rusting in a field. And yet, against all odds, it survived. Not because of grand institutional vision or government policy, but because of individuals who refused to let it disappear. People who saw value where others saw scrap metal. People who understood that history isn't just about the biggest, the fastest, or the most powerful. It's about the first steps, the humble beginnings, the machines that made everything else possible. Ballaarat was never going to be celebrated for its power or elegance. It was a rough utilitarian machine built by a provincial foundry with limited resources. But it proved something crucial, that Australian industry could meet Australian needs, that local foundries could build steam locomotives, that the colonies didn't have to rely entirely on British imports. It was a small step, but it was the first one. The story of Ballaarat is ultimately a story about value, about what we choose to remember and what we allow to fade away. For most of its existence, this little engine was dismissed, too small to be useful, too crude to be impressive, too damaged to be worth saving. It survived not because anyone fought for it in those critical early decades, but because it was simply too much trouble to scrap. That indifference nearly cost Australia its oldest surviving locomotive. But in the end, people did care. The volunteers who spent months painstaking restoring corroded metal, the machining company that donated expertise and equipment, the lottery commission that funded the work, the local community that had watched the engine rust for generations and finally said, enough. They understood something fundamental. History is fragile. It doesn't preserve itself. Every artifact, every building, every rusting engine in a field exists only because someone decided it mattered. And when no one decides that, when indifference becomes the default, history simply disappears. Ballaarat spent over a century being forgotten, abandoned, dismissed as a poor specimen, unworthy of preservation. It survived fires, neglect, rust, and the corrosive belief that it wasn't significant enough to save. But it's still here, not because it was powerful or famous or beloved by the public, but because eventually, finally, someone looked at that rusting pile of iron and saw not what it had become, but what it represented. The first steam engine to operate in Western Australia, the first narrow-gauge locomotive built in Australia, a bridge between the age of horses and the age of steel. And in the end, that was enough. Today, visitors to the old Busselton railway station can stand beside Ballaarat and touch the same metal that rolled through the Jarrah forests in 1871. They can see the wheels that carried Australia's industrial future, one timber load at a time. It's not a grand engine. It never was. But it was first. And sometimes being first is the most important thing of all.